Hello, everybody. My name is JD McBride, and welcome to the Vertebrae. And for you returning viewers, welcome back. Tonight, I am excited to share with you my original story, Homegrown, the spiritual successor to the Disciples of the Archangels. But before we begin, I would like to extend a sincere thank you to two people. Case Gibran, who helped with the videography on that wonderful cinematic intro you saw before the video, and Landon Pierce, who produced the original song for the intro. Now, Landon Pierce is a recording artist on YouTube, and he is criminally underrated. So I'll link his channel and go send him some love after the video. Before we begin, a word of warning. This story contains descriptions of intense violence, suicide, graphic depictions of gore. If you are sensitive to any of these topics, viewer discretion is strongly advised. And, without further ado, the story. I was sitting on the curb in front of a cafe drinking when I got the call. Hello? I said. This is Antiqua Farms. I saw your resume and wanted to give you a call. A man with a gravelly country accent said. Where did you see my resume? I asked, confused by the unsolicited call. We got your resume from a recruiter and wanted to ask if you wanted to interview for our farmhand position, the man said. I was confused because I hadn't submitted my resume to any recruiter. What is the pay and hours? I asked, deciding to just go with it. I had lost my job and gotten evicted the month prior, so any job would have been a godsend. $25 an hour, free lodging, the man said. I would like to interview for the position, I said, enticed by the offer. Do you have any experience working on a farm? The man prodded. No, but I worked as a carpenter for a while, I said, trying to sound experienced. I wasn't a carpenter per se. I worked as a general laborer. I wasn't even a trained construction worker either. I had an English degree, but it turns out there's no jobs for Englishmen. But I still could frame a wall and read a blueprint. Worked, you say, the man said, sounding intrigued. I'll take it you don't work as a carpenter anymore. No, sir, I do not, I said with a hint of nerves. Why? The man said. What happened? They laid me off, Downsizing, they said, I remarked. All right, well, come down to my farm tomorrow morning at 9 and I'll conduct the interview, the man said with a sigh. He then spit out an address at me, which I had to write on the back of my hand. Suddenly it hit me. Why did he ask about my experience if he had my resume? I quickly pushed the thought to the back of my mind and went to sleep in the back of my truck. I typed the farm's address into Google Maps, and it routed me to this group of buildings way outside of city limits. I drove over the highway and into the boondocks. The small town buildings gave way to fields filled with little sprouts of plants to be. Finally, I saw it up ahead. It consisted of a large, white sheet metal building with no windows, a canopy made from wood and welded steel that had several tractors parked underneath it, and various grain bins of various sizes. I saw a man wearing a bulletproof vest standing next to the only road into the compound. As I turned onto the road, he flagged me down and walked to my driver's side window, gesturing me to roll it down. I complied, and he stuck out his hand as if asking me for something. I'm here for a job interview, I said, creeped out. He didn't say anything back, just stood there statue still with his hand out. Can you tell me what you want? I asked, but I still got no response, just a dead-eyed stare. Then I saw a beat-up Chevy pickup heading down the road towards me. As the man driving got closer, I could make out his features. He was probably 60 years old, with small, watery eyes, and a brow that casted a shadow over his face. He pulled up next to my truck and rolled down his window. John, let this man through for heaven's sake, the man said in the same voice I heard on the phone. John lowered his arm to his side and marched stiff-legged back to the side of the road without a word. Don't mind him. He don't like strangers, the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Meet me down the way and I'll show you around. I stepped on the gas and glanced in my rear view to see him do a 3-point turn to head back the way he came. I pulled into a parking spot and the Chevy pulled up next to me. We both stepped out of our vehicles and I saw how gangly tall this man was. He towered over me and observed me with his ghoulish eyes. I averted his gaze and instead chose to survey my surroundings. The buildings were so much larger up close. The main building was at least 25 feet tall and had 3 huge garage doors on the front. The canopy was about 15 feet tall, and the steel roof had rusted through in several places. Around the rest of the football field-sized courtyard was a dozen hulking grain bins. They all loomed over the rest of the buildings, and even the smallest among them was still a full story taller than the main building. The sun in the east backlit the grain bins and casted shadows over the courtyard. "Well, this is the main compound where most of the operation occurs," the man said. "My name is Kenny Dunklermeister, by the way. Over there is the main workshop," Mr. Dunklermeister said. "Most of our repairs, machining, and welding goes on there." "All right, Mr. Dunklermeister," I said. "Don't call me that. Just call me Kenny," said Kenny. We walked through a metal door into the interior of the workshop. 2 large fans hung from the metal rafters, and fluorescent lights casted harsh light onto the shiny concrete floor. A semi-truck was parked next to a bucket truck in the far corner. Bins of bean and corn seeds lined the nearest wall. A large workbench ran the length of the back wall, and a man stood hunched over a work table with a welding electrode throwing sparks all around himself. The harsh light flashed into my eyes and made me tear up. "Don't look directly at the arc while someone's welding. It'll burn your eyes," said Kenny. I nodded and he started walking towards the welder. "Hey, Tim," Kenny said, and the welder pulled up the electrode and flipped his mask up. "This is James. He's the new hire." "New hire?" My heart leaped with excitement at the word. Tim had soot all over his face. He had a strong chin and large eyes. His cheeks were hollow, and his lips were pale and thin. His face scrunched up at the words like he'd just ate something sour. "Don't worry, he ain't replacing you. He's here to help with construction, and is his extra set of hands," Kenny said with something like a soft tone. Tim's scowl retreated from his face, but he still eyed me suspiciously. "As you were," Kenny said, and Tim flipped down his helmet and went back to work. "He's a tad prickly, but he'll warm up to you pretty soon," he said. He walked over to a door across the workshop and clawed it open with his talon-like fingers. "In here is the punch-in clock. You will clock in here at the beginning of your shift and out at the end," he said, pointing to an almost antique card puncher. The clock-in room was about the size of a walk-in closet and smelled like rotting meat. Kenny walked past me, and that's when I discovered that it was him that stunk, not the room. I winced at the stench and continued following him. "That's about all there is to see in here, so let me take you to where you'll be working," he said while walking to the door. I followed, almost jogging to keep up with him. "The construction site is quite a ways away, so we'll take my truck," Kenny said, opening the driver's side door of the pickup. I hopped in the passenger seat and fought to overcome the urge to gag at the smell. We drove out past the grain bins onto this bumpy dirt road. Then the site came into view. It was a dirt slot with a 40 by 40 foot concrete slab in the center. Piles of lumber sat on the southwest corner of the slab, and a large pile of wooden crates sat catty-corner to the lumber. "Here's the job site," Kenny said as he reached for the door handle. We both got out of the truck and walked to the front of the slab. "This will be a storage shed when complete," he said, spitting onto the ground. "You'll do the carpentry and Tim will do the metalworking." "Okay, do you have any blueprints I can look at?" I asked, half expecting him to say no. "Here," Kenny said, as he produced a bundle of blue paper from his filthy Carhartt coat and thrust them into my hands. I was surprised by the sudden movement and almost dropped the papers. "Just look over those for today. The work begins tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp," Kenny said, looking at me through his beak-like nose. "All right, so what do I do today?" I asked as I broke eye contact. "I'm gonna take you to your living quarters and you're gonna take a shower, because you need it." Kenny said with a hollow chuckle that made me shiver. I nodded and we both turned to walk back to the truck. He drove me to my truck and told me to follow him. We both drove to a little house a mile down the road. It had white siding and a red door on the far left. 2 windows adorned the front wall, equal distance from the door and each other. I pulled into the driveway and put my truck in park next to Kenny's truck. We sauntered down the path leading from the driveway to the front door. He tossed the keys at me and I caught them effortlessly. "There's furniture, food, water, and utilities in there. If it ain't to your liking, you can head into town and get what you please," Kenny said. "Thank you kindly, sir," I said with endless appreciation. He nodded and got back into his truck. The interior of the house was nothing impressive. The living room and kitchen were separated by a fake marble counter. The living room had a beat-up couch against one wall and a TV on the opposite wall. I spotted a fridge in the kitchen and went to inspect its contents. Nothing. The fridge had nothing in it. I resorted to rummaging through the cabinets until, Jackpot. The cabinet furthest from the fridge had all sorts of cereal, canned soups, and snack in it. I hadn't a good meal in 3 days, so I gorged myself on a box of Fruit Loops. Once I was done feasting, I headed down the adjacent hallway. The first door was a bathroom with a stand-up shower. The one across the hall was an empty room. The door at the very end of the hallway led to a bedroom with a full-size mattress on the floor. Sure, it wasn't much, but it was the best lodging I'd had in a month. After a nice hot shower, I moved all my belongings out of my truck into a heap in the center of the living room. I was too tired to deal with sorting that mess, so I went to bed. Nearly the instant my head hit the pillow, I was out like a light. I slept for about 22 hours and only awoke when my alarm went off. I hurried and grabbed some clothes from the heap in the living room and shoved some food into my mouth. It was around 7:45 when I hit the door. Thankfully, I arrived with time to spare. The moment I stepped through the door, Kenny ambushed me. I jumped with fright and turned to face him. "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you," he said with another hollow chuckle. "I'm just here to take you to the job site." I nodded as I resumed my journey to the clock-in room. I punched a little time card with my name on it and headed back outside. Kenny was in the driver's seat of his truck. Tim and that weirdo John were sitting in the bed. I vaulted into the bed of the truck to join the others, and like that, we were in motion. The truck rolled straight backwards, then turned right onto the road towards the job site. Tim was giving me the evil eye, and John just stared off into nothing. It's like he doesn't even have a brain. Halfway into the trip, John suddenly twitched and a terrified expression flickered across his face. But in an instant, he returned back to blankly staring. The short and awkward trip ended when Kenny hit the brakes hard and sent us sliding into the cab. We all hopped out and walked up to the fountain. Some additions had been made in my absence. A nylon canopy had been erected at the edge of the foundation, and a foldable table with blueprints lining it sat under the shade of the canopy. An industrial generator was connected to a portable welder at a safe distance from the flammable canopy. Lastly, an excavator had been parked with the arm over the west side of the foundation. "Well, you've got all you need, so go on and get to work," Kenny said, leaning out the open window. "Oh, and John here will supervise you while y'all work for safety reasons." With his final word, he rolled up the window and backed up, pulled away further down the dirt road. I looked at Tim, then I looked at John. John was already robotically walking to the very edge of the job site. I broke the idleness and headed over to read the blueprints. The blueprints were quite simple. No walled-off rooms, just one big one. No fancy insulation, just bare studs. Simple as simple gets. Tim walked up next to me and read his blueprints. His expression got even nastier than it was by default. "What?" I asked, expecting no response. "I've never seen anything like this for a storage shed," Tim said with bewilderment overcoming his annoyance. "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. "Well, to start, the whole inside wall is to be lined with welded steel plate," he said, tracing a portion of the blueprint with his finger. "And the rafters are supposed to have 1-inch steel pipe welded underneath them. Have you ever seen anything like this before?" Tim asked with pure confusion in his eyes. "No, never," I said, equally confused. I looked up and saw John swivel his neck to face us with surgical precision. "I don't know, just build it and don't ask questions," I said, unnerved by John. "Yeah," Tim said, reading my tone. We both acquired our respective tools from the crates and did our work in tense silence. Finally, Tim went over to one crate and produced a portable radio. We listened to the alternative rock station until lunchtime. We both put our tools down and sat next to each other on the edge of the concrete. Tim was welding pieces of sheet metal end to end all morning. He'd made some good progress. I was framing walls and I was close to getting one side done. I realized I forgot to pack a lunch and sighed heavily. Tim looked over me while he put a cigarette to a light. "Want one?" he asked after his first puff. "Yeah," I said haggardly. He lit up my cigarette and we sat side by side puffing away our hunger, looking over at the scenery. I noticed Kenny's truck parked by a shed down the ways. "What's over there?" I asked, pointing to the structure. "Kenny's woodworking shed," Tim said, punctuating the last two words with air quotes. "He's always out there in his spare time. Don't try and go near it, though. He'll flip his shit." I nodded and slowly pondered. I'd never worked at a farm before, but this much strange stuff couldn't be normal. I didn't care, though. I just wanted to get paid. We worked the rest of the day away with a pace that slowed by the hour. By 8 p.m. we were both completely exhausted, and were ecstatic to see Kenny's truck coming to pick us up. He came to a stop and we hopped into the back without a word. John lagged behind, sauntering at a zombie-like pace. He climbed into the bed with poker-stiff limbs, like his body was skin wrapped around a stick doll. Suddenly, John twitched and flung his body towards the tailgate. My skin crawled. Then I noticed the stench radiating out from the cab of the truck. I dry heaved at the hellish rotting meat smell. No one spoke a word on the ride back. We were too busy trying not to vomit to speak. I hustled to clock out and get in my truck. Thankfully, I was quick enough to avoid talking to Kenny. I drove home and melted into my bed once again, neglecting the pile of belongings inhabiting my living room. I woke up to the alarm pounding in my ears. Like all the days before, I shoveled some of the now dwindling food into my mouth and hit the door. An April morning shower was coming down over the land. I didn't worry about working in the rain. Our region was prone to showers of rain that didn't stick around. As I pulled up the lane into the compound, I dreaded talking to Kenny. That's when I noticed Kenny's Chevy was gone. Standing in the unoccupied parking space was John. He was soaked, and rainwater ran off him in beads and streams. He noticed me and robotically rotated his head to follow me as I pulled into the parking space. Tim had already arrived and sat in his truck smoking a cigarette. I hopped out to clock in, and on my way back from the clock-in machine, I stopped at Tim's driver's side window. He rolled it down and asks, "What do you want?" "What are we supposed to do when Kenny's gone?" I asked him. "He does this sometime. Just hop in my truck and we'll head out," Tim said with a sigh, as if he expected me to know the procedure already. I walked around and climbed into the passenger seat. "What about John?" I asked. "What about him?" Tim asked with an even more annoyed tone. I took the hint and shut up. When we pulled up to the job site, the rain was still coming down hard. "What the fuck?" Tim yelled. "Did he hire me to be a fucking underwater welder?" I looked over at Tim as he began to punch the steering wheel. I shivered. He reminded me of my dad. We waited in the truck until the rain finally stopped and the sunlight peered through the cloud cover. It was 8:30 when we got to work. All in all, it was a normal morning. At one point, I hit my finger hard with a hammer and took a walk to the road to ease the pain. I looked back towards the compound and saw John marching towards this job site. He moved at a steady but slow pace. He was unyielding. His pace never faltered once. I had a gut feeling. No, I knew that something about this place wasn't right. It didn't matter at the time, though. We had a job to do. By our lunch break, John had arrived and taken up position at the corner of the job site, watching. Me and Tim sat on the foundation. He pulled out his pack of cigarettes and I put my fingers out wordlessly to ask for one. He obliged me and we sat together smoking. No words, just the occasional wheezing cough. Off to the west, a line of storms was moving in, a black imposing wall of rain and wind. We watched it move in, and we hopped to our feet, ready to run to the truck. When the line of storms was about to envelop the compound, it split down the middle like the parting of the Red Sea. The storm was now divided into a horseshoe shape, sunlight over the farm, rain everywhere else. Me and Tim watched dumbfounded as the storm joined back in the east, leaving us in a perfect pocket of sunshine. "Ever seen anything like this?" I asked Tim. "A couple times. Storms just never hit us," Tim said, flicking a cigarette butt into the grass. I was weirded out even with the explanation, but thankful the storm didn't hit us. For the rest of the day, the storm swirled around us, and at times lightning would light up the shroud of storms. My paranoid brain would see shapes in the flashes of lights, shapes of towering pillars and skulls. Though every time I caught one of these shapes in the corner of my eye, a bolt of fear shot through me. I kept at it. We worked until 8 p.m. again. Me and Tim hopped in the truck. "You want to hit the bar?" Tim asked. "Hell yes, I need a drink," I said. Tim nodded approvingly and put the truck in drive. We parked under an impossibly bright neon sign and headed inside. The bar was dingy, dimly lit, and covered in a haze of cigarette smoke. When I sat down, I could scarcely see the door from the seat of our bar. I ordered a pint of piss beer, and Tim ordered a double of bourbon. "Starting off strong tonight," I said, chuckling. "It gets the metal out of my throat," Tim said with joking anger. We shot the breeze until our drinks came. Then I sipped on my beer and Tim pounded back his shot. The conversation ebbed and flowed until around 11 p.m. when we left. "You good to drive?" I asked. "Yeah, I'm fine," Tim slurred. I was a little scared to let Tim behind the wheel, but he seemed to know what he was doing. I got home without incident and fell asleep. I woke up the next day feeling rested for the first time since starting the job. It was Saturday, so I had the day off. I sauntered down to the kitchen and opened the cabinet, and was dismayed to find there was no food left. Shit, I mumbled to myself as I went to grab some clothes from the pile. I threw on some grease-stained jeans and a crusty old shirt. I grabbed my wallet and headed down to the Dollar General in town. I opened my wallet and saw I had only $10, so I only purchased some store-brand snacks and cereal. Hunger was gnawing at me as I clawed open a package of cereal. I ate in my truck like a crazed animal and put it in gear when I was satisfied. I pulled in my driveway and was surprised to see Kenny's truck pulling up behind me, except Kenny wasn't driving. John was. I got out of my vehicle and John got out of his. We met at the midpoint between our trucks, and we stared one another down. "What do you want, John?" I asked, annoyed at this weirdo's presence on my day off. He reached into his pocket, removed a note, and robotically swiveled his arm outwards. I reached out and grabbed the note, being careful not to get too close. The note had, "You are needed urgently at the woodworking shed," scrawled across it in sloppy cursive. I looked up from the note and asked John, "Do I get in your truck or what?" The only response I got was a blank stare. I rolled my eyes and walked over to get into the passenger seat of the truck. When I got into the truck, John made a quick about-face and climbed back in through the open driver's side door. He drove maniacally quick, but surprisingly precisely. He didn't seem to get the concept of gradually braking, because when he got to a turn, he'd slam on the brakes, come to a complete stop, then make the turn. We drove up to the compound and passed it down the dirt road. A pit in my stomach opened up when we passed the job site, and it only got deeper as we drew closer to the woodworking shed. John parked the truck next to the black van with rental plates in front of the shed. I stepped out and felt my foot squish into the marshy ground beneath it, while my nose felt like it was being melted off by the hideous stench surrounding the area. I dry heaved, and as I was facing down trying not to vomit, I noticed the ground wasn't marshy from water, but from a mysterious black greasy substance. I lost the battle to keep down my breakfast and spewed vomit onto the grass. I wiped my mouth and looked up to see Kenny striding towards me. "What do you need?" I said, panting. "Follow me," Kenny said, his country accent menacing as ever. As I followed him to the back of the shed where a concrete structure sat buried in the dirt. On the far side of the structure stood a green-faced Tim. He looked just as nauseous as me. "The sewage line broke and I'd need your help to fix it," Kenny said, pointing at a metal pipe sticking out of the concrete. The pipe was oozing the same black substance in the grass out of a large lateral crack on its side. I looked back at Kenny and realized he didn't look near as disgusted by the smell as we were. In fact, he didn't even seem to be fazed. We got to work following Kenny's orders. He had me wrench a rusted valve at the base of the pipe shut, and Tim used a small portable welder to lay a shiny metal bead over the crack. We worked swiftly so that we could escape the hellish stench as soon as possible. At one point I had downtime and wandered over to the wall of the shed. I leaned against it and watched Kenny inspect Tim's weld. When he stood up straight and saw me leaning against the shed, he lost it. "Get the fuck away from there!" he yelled as he stomped over to me, bent over at the waist looking like a praying mantis. I jumped away from the wall like it was on fire. "What the hell?" I said, exasperated. "You never fucking touch that shed, you hear me?" Kenny yelled in my face, little droplets of spittle showering me. "You hear me?" he repeated, but louder. "Yes," I said, surprised and startled by the sudden rage. "You know what? Y'all can leave. I'll finish this myself," Kenny yelled, moving his mandible like a hand in a circle gesture. John, who had been silently observing, walked around the shed to the truck. We followed not far behind. The drive was lurchy and silent as John dropped us off at our houses. As I trudged up the pathway to my door, I noticed the trail of black, greasy footprints I left in the concrete. I sat down on the front steps and clawed my boots off. They smelled like the shed. The door slamming behind me extinguished the smell, and I decided to use my newfound free time to sort my belongings. I was halfway done placing my stuff in their allotted area when I remembered the food I left in my truck. I took careful sock-footed steps around the black footprints. I looked down at the berry circles cereal and gummy fruit worms in the passenger seat. The mental images of bugs, worms, and beetles crawling around the inside of the packages beat any thought of eating out of my mind. Once the sorting was done, I realized I forgot to buy something. I walked to the edge of my driveway and sat down Indian style on the ground, lamenting my lack of a cigarette. The field across the street sloped down into a meandering creek. A solid wall of trees stood beyond the creek, casting a shadow across the field. I noticed much more about my surroundings now that I didn't have something to distract me. The birds sang a chaotic yet beautiful symphony. The crickets had begun their screeching drone, and the bullfrogs croaked in the distance. A flock of swallows dive-bombed 50 feet or more to hover up as many mosquitoes as possible. I sat watching the sun sink beneath the trees for more than a half hour. Eventually, the light diminished to the point I could no longer see the wonderful dance of life, and I begrudgingly returned inside. The rest of the evening was me laying in bed, staring at my ceiling, wondering, what in God's name was in that shed? What is wrong with John? Why did Kenny get so mad at me? The thoughts whirlwinded around my head until, finally, I couldn't stay up any longer. I showed up at work at 8 a.m. and Kenny was waiting outside. Beside him was somebody I hadn't seen before. He was a rough-looking man with a heavy equipment company shirt on. When me and Tim walked up, Kenny announced, "This is Hunter. He's here to operate the excavator." Me and Tim side-eyed each other, then looked at Kenny. He bent his neck sideways to our eye level. The look in his eyes told us not to ask any questions and comply, so we climbed into the bed of Kenny's truck, save for John, who was absent. Hunter wasn't the conversational type. Every attempt to start conversation was met with grunts and one-word answers. The man climbed out of the truck and climbed into the cab of the excavator. "Not much of a talker," Tim said, prodding my side. "Yeah," I said, but I was drowned out by the excavator engine roaring to life. My work was light compared to the previous. I put ratchet straps around the framed wall. Then, when they were upright, I secured them to the foundation with anchor screws. Rinse repeat 3 times, and we had 3 wall frames up. Then came the inside metal sheeting. Tim had put some good work in and welded 3 wall-sized pieces of steel up. The excavator lifted them over the walls, and Tim welded them on anchors so they could be secured to the studs. I had some downtime, so I walked over to Kenny, who was standing by his truck. As I got within arm's length, he slumped over at the hips with one shoulder cocked towards the ground looking at me. I never worked up the courage to say anything more than a few stutters. I awkwardly walked backwards, maintaining eye contact with Kenny as he returned to standing poker straight. I leaned up against a stud and watched Kenny hop in his truck and speed off towards his woodworking shed. By 8 p.m. we had all the wall frames up and the metal linings up. We all gathered around the front of the job site and milled around waiting for Kenny to show up. After 30 minutes, we made the decision to walk back. Finally, after about halfway back, we saw Kenny's headlights shining behind us. He stopped for us to get in, then punched the gas hard, sending us tumbling towards the tailgate. When we got back to the compound, he slowed slightly to pull into a parking space and slammed on the brakes, lurching us forward. The exterior lights illuminated the truck bed, and I saw dark red stains covering the bed. It was concentrated in the large outline of a puddle. Droplets and splatter marks covered the remainder of the bed. I tried to make sense of it, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was deer blood. Maybe it wasn't blood at all. These thoughts buzzed around my head, but I failed to convince myself. I clocked out and practically ran back to my truck. I sped out of there but didn't go home. I headed to the bar to find Tim. I could see the neon sign from a mile away, shining brilliantly in the night. I strode into the bar and scanned for Tim. I spotted him at a table across the bar with 3 other guys. I walked over and Tim said, "Hey, good to see you here," with a smile. "I need to talk to you," I yelled over the blaring music. "What?" Tim shouted, gesturing to his ear. "I said I need to talk to you outside," I yelled even louder than before. Tim looked at each of the guys in his group and got up. We walked into the nighttime air and he said, "If you're here to confess your love, now's not the time." Tim said, chuckling. "No," I said with a grave tone. "It's about Kenny." "Shit," Tim said. "Yeah, listen, you've known him longer than me, so have you ever seen what he does in his woodworking shed?" I asked, staring Tim in the eyes. "One time I tried, but Kenny found me and threatened to fire me," Tim said. "And he was so angry I thought he would hit me." "Does he hunt?" I asked, not truly wanting to know the answer. "I asked him a while back and he said it's a waste of time," Tim said, narrowing his eyes. "Why?" "He had a big blood stain in the bed of his truck," I gravely declared. Tim exhaled and cracked his neck. "We have to find out what's in there," I said, trying to persuade Tim and myself at the same time. "We need to do the right thing." "No way in hell I'm going near that place," Tim said with fear in his voice. "What if someone's trapped in there? Or what if there's a body in there? We have to find out," I said, once again trying to persuade myself more than Tim. Tim's eyes darted back and forth as if he was weighing the options on a scale in his mind's eye. Fuck, alright, I'll help you, Tim said, sounding defeated. But we need a plan. The shed has 2 padlocks on it, so we'll need some bolt cutters, I said. We can just use a magnet to force the shackle open, Tim said. I nodded, and then he said, We can take your truck down the way, I declared. Kill the headlights as we approach. Why my truck? Tim said with hostility. Because it's quieter, I asserted. Tim nodded, and we both walked the green mile back to his truck. The ride to the farm seemed to drag on forever. My hands were quivering with anxiety, and whenever the blinking light of the turn signal illuminated Tim's hands, they were in the same state as mine. If the ride with the headlights on felt like 1,000 years, the ride down the dirt road with the headlights off felt like an eternity. We could smell the shed long before its black silhouette came into view. I opened my door, which turned on the interior lights. I looked at Tim in his face and saw the dread in his eyes. I shot a look and he averted my gaze. I had walked all the way around the nose of the truck by the time Tim got out. He held a stack of neodymium magnets in between his index and middle fingers like a cigarette. We walked up to the door and Tim sighed before putting the stack up to the side of the first lock, producing a satisfying click and releasing the shackle. He repeated the process on the second lock and got the same results. Tim got ready to turn the doorknob but hesitated and said, Should we really do this? Is it worth it? Both the questions and the apprehension in his voice angered me. We've made it this far. It's too far to stop now, I growled angrily. He sighed and pulled the door open, but something halted the door from opening 1/10 of the way in. I walked up to the door and saw a metal latch securing the door from the inside. I dislodged the latch from its shoring and opened the door all the way. The moment the door opened, it was as if the gates of hell opened and belched its stench through the entryway. I fought hard to keep the contents of my stomach from escaping. After I placed my shirt over my nose, I lit up my flashlight. The door opened up to a staircase going down about 5 feet. The meager light from my flashlight couldn't illuminate any further than the last step. I looked back at Tim and saw that the dread had not just twisted his expression but also compelled him to shake. I didn't even ask if he was going to follow me. I already knew he wouldn't. As I descended each step, the terror crescendoed in intensity. Finally, at the bottom of the staircase, I angled my flashlight up, and what I saw I could scarcely believe. The shed was just the cap on a concrete pit going down about 6 feet. The last step wasn't actually the last step, just the last visible step. 2, maybe 3 steps were concealed by a sea of what on first inspection could be mistaken for old engine oil, except the stench radiating off it and the solid chunks of what looked like potted meat floating in it proved it wasn't oil, but liquid decomposition. It was black and thick with coagulated blood and bone fragments stuck out of it like islands in the ocean. I could have convinced myself the rotting corpses that produced this vile cesspool weren't human until my flashlight illuminated an eyeless human skull with pieces of meat and skin still stuck to it. I swept my flashlight back and forth, taking in the scope of this illegitimate mass grave. There were so many bones. So many bones. Hundreds of each type and in every state of decay. I saw the sternum of a picked clean rib cage sticking out above the surface. I saw a pair of legs folded at the knees being swarmed by bugs. The bugs. Oh God, the bugs. Maggots, worms, cockroaches, and beetles wriggled and writhed like waves on a sea of decay. There had to be at least 100,000 of them feasting on the grotesque buffet. Then my flashlight lit up the centerpiece of the whole arrangement. A black stone obelisk standing as high as the ceiling, maybe 10 feet, terminating in a sharp point. Its shiny, immaculately polished surface was covered in intricate engravings that now seemed to glow red. It was so beautiful. The most beautiful construct I've ever laid eyes on. It was beautiful to such a degree I averted my eyes and flashlight to look at the corner to my left. It had a person-sized mirror that was so grimy it scarcely reflected light. Even still, I saw an armchair in the reflection, catty-corner to the mirror. I looked back at the obelisk. The engravings had shifted. And spoke to me in a voice so sweet and mild. The voice compelled my legs forward, sloshing through the grease, and my arm outwards to touch the warm stone face. What I saw next cannot be adequately described by earthly words, but I will try. The moment my hand made contact, I was in a black void lacking in any substance, color, or feeling. Describing the void as black is inaccurate. Black implies the absence of light, and this void contained nothing in its most total form. Then, an iridescent spark lit up the darkness, or more accurately, it lit up the nothingness. The colors streaked and twisted into shapes and meaning. I watched the grassy ground form beneath me and the brilliant blue sky being painted above me. I watched my legs form and ascend to join my descending torso. Then it was complete. I was in a mountain valley with a great blue lake before me. I moved my legs and arms around clumsily, getting used to the new body woven for me. I looked up at the impressively tall, snow-capped mountains, then at the sky, their peaks pierced. It was as bright as high noon on a clear day, but no sun provided the light. No, instead an orb of light, brighter than 1,000 suns, but not painful to observe, inhabited the center of the lake. I felt the mild voice guiding me to walk into the lake, to bathe and cleanse myself. I obeyed. I was on the sands of the beach when I realized that the lake was not water, but a rich, glittering sapphire blue nectar. I walked into the nectar. It was perfectly warm and perfectly cool on my skin, the exact temperature of the air. As I waded deeper, and I felt my skin loosen its grip on my muscles. I felt every inch of my body exposed to the nectar, relax in a way I'd never felt before. It was ecstasy. I waded closer to the sphere of light, but when I was waist deep in the lake, I felt a strong tug pulling me backwards. Then, in a perfect inverse of the creation of this place, all the colors collapsed back down to a singular point, leaving me in darkness. The darkness became less intense, and I was back ankle deep in the decomposition, with Tim pulling me away from the obelisk by my chest. I should have been angry at him for tearing me away from my Eden. I should have been disgusted by the worms wriggling in the free space of my boots. I should have been scared and confused by my sudden shift in perception, but I wasn't. A strong buzz was radiating through my body and calming all my emotions. It was bliss. As he dragged me back up the stairs, I saw the blinking light of a security camera in the far left corner of the room, and I saw the engravings glow intensely as ever. Tim dragged me into the midnight air, then placed me in the passenger seat of his truck. He threw the truck in drive and punched the gas. The only sounds as we traveled away from the shed were Tim muttering to himself and the hum of the engine, both in almost equal volume. Then, we saw dim headlights up the road traveling towards us, the same dim headlights on Kenny's truck. The road was too narrow to swerve around the rapidly approaching vehicle, so Tim did the only thing he could do. He stopped the truck. Kenny's truck slowed and rolled to a stop 10 feet from our bumper. His high beams were shining right through the windshield, blinding both of us. We sat in silence for about 10 seconds. Then came the gunshots to shatter the silence. 3 shots rang out in quick succession. I ducked, not from fear but from reflex. I heard the bullet shatter the windshield and then hit something fleshy. I looked over and saw Tim had been thrown backwards by the impact. He groaned with pain. Then, as the bloody stain saturating his shirt reached his lap, he fell forwards on the steering wheel. His foot also fell on the accelerator and the truck shot forward. The engine roared and the truck drove about 10 yards before crashing into the ditch. The wheels kept spinning and dug themselves further into the ground. I saw 2 silhouettes on either side of the truck approach. The one on my side opened the door, turning on the interior lights. I saw Kenny's evil, raven-like face, then felt his talons grip my arm and tear me out of the truck with impossible strength. He threw me onto my knees, and then I looked into his face. It was a mix of bloodlust and fury that made him look borderline demonic. I looked over and saw John open the driver's side door, reach over Tim's lifeless body, and turn off the truck. The interior lights stayed on for a few more seconds, and I saw John bend down to pick up his long, wood-stocked rifle. "You just couldn't stay out of where you don't belong," Kenny said with the full fury of all the circles of hell. "You just couldn't wait for the prophesied time." I felt the buzz start to wear off and the terror creeping in. "You were meant to be the apprentice. You were meant to take my place," Kenny said, his country accent never more terrifying. "You ruined it. You ruined my plan." Kenny looked back at John and his eyes widened. I looked as well and mirrored his expression. John was standing about 5 feet from Kenny, his rifle shouldered and aimed squarely at Kenny's head. Kenny tried to speak, and I even saw him start to raise his hands, but he was cut short by John squeezing the trigger. The bullet went squarely through Kenny's forehead, blowing a trench through Kenny's cranium. His muscles seized and fell backwards, stiff as a board. I looked at John and saw him place the rifle under his chin and squeeze the trigger once more. His head exploded like a firecracker covered in ground beef. His knees buckled and he crumpled to the ground. I couldn't even begin to describe the feeling. It was like someone slowed down time by 1,000. It made my vision blurry and swirly and made my ears ring. I tried to get up, but just fell over on my side. I intended to lay there in the grass and just wait to die, but the pool of blood creeping towards me prompted me to throw myself onto my back. I couldn't do anything but stare up into the stars and listen to the gentle hum of Kenny's truck. The stars above me served as a backdrop for the events to repeat over and over in my mind's eye. I felt my stomach contents force their way up my throat, and I didn't even try to stop it. I leaned my head over and vomited. I laid there in the dark for what felt like days until I heard sirens in the distance. The police found me in the middle of a double murder-suicide, so they assumed I was guilty enough to cuff me and put me in the back of the cruiser. In the hour or two I was in the back of the car, an army of cops arrived. 24 cars, 3 vans, and God knows how many officers. Multiple times during my detainment, they opened the door and tried asking me questions. I didn't even try to answer. Words were beyond me. It's not that I didn't want to, I just couldn't even begin to figure out what sounds and what order could describe what I saw. At some point, 2 officers took me out back of the car and handed me over to 4 guys dressed in black jackets who placed me in the back of a featureless van. During the exchange, I saw they had all set up markers around all the items and put tarps over the corpses. I shivered and my knees still almost gave out. As the men were closing the door on the van, I saw the big yellow letters DAA on the back of their jackets. I stayed in the back of the van for a little while before a paramedic opened the door holding a needle. They injected me and I instantly felt woozy, then sleepy, then I passed out. I awoke on the bed in the corner of a windowless concrete room. I looked next to me and saw a desk and chair bolted to the floor. I looked in the other corner and saw a man in a white lab coat looking at me. He was short, bald, and kind of fat. "Welcome back," he said, before putting on his badge to the door, opening it up and leaving. I lapsed in and out of consciousness for several more hours before I decided to get up. I discovered the room had an attached bathroom, and that at some point a notebook and pencil had been placed on the desk. I felt drawn to the paper. I picked up the pencil and began to write. When the pencil touched paper, a voice spoke to me from within my head. The same voice I heard in the lake, the same voice from the pillar. Whenever I reached a point where I can't remember what happened or I don't know what to say, the voice tells me what to write. Whenever it speaks, I feel this calming sensation walk over me. The doctor came around to ask me some questions. I didn't say anything. The voice told me not to. He brought me a tray of food, but I ignored it. I don't know why I've written this. Maybe so someone could understand, or maybe so I could get it out of my head. Maybe to please the voice. Looking at all the words on this page, I feel at peace. I try to remember what happened, but it feels like someone recounting what happened to them, to me. The memories don't hurt anymore. I can rest now. And that was Homegrown. This story was a blast to write. It was a bit tedious to read, but I'm happy to be putting it out here. Now, I used a new effect on my audio editing software to make the whole editing process a little less tedious for me. Let me know how you like the new audio quality. I can go back to doing it manually if you don't like the audio, so just let me know. And this world that I've built, the Pillars world, it will continue. There will be more stories related to this world. It's just I don't want to get burnt out on it, so I'm going to be writing some other one-offs. So stay tuned for that. And as always, I've been your host, JD McBride. This has been the Vertebrae. Good night.